Just over 4 months to go until the U.S. presidential election on November the 3rd, and the situation is not looking positive for sitting U.S. President Donald Trump. According to the latest polls, he's falling behind his Democratic rival Joe Biden by 8% to 14%. But analysts are saying it is still too early to write him off. How will China-U.S. ties be shaped in either a Trump or Biden victory? How can China prepare for either possibility? Joining me for the discussion on the phone is Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and from Bordentown, New Jersey, Jack Perkowski, founder and managing partner of JFP Holdings. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Jack, let me go to you first. As I said, polls are not looking too good for Mr. Trump. A new national Ipsos Reuters poll finds Joe Biden leading President Trump by 13%. While Biden has led Trump in almost every Ipsos poll this year, his advantage this week is the largest so far. In other polls, Trump also falls behind by 8% to 14%. So is Trump doomed to fail in the election coming up in November, or is it still too early to call?
I think it's still a little bit too early. You know, there's a saying in U.S. elections that 4 months, for example, is an eternity. A lot can happen in 4 months. Just think of, you know, where we were back 4 months ago and how much has changed since then. So I think the point is that it's still very early. A lot can happen over the next 4 months. These polls in the past have had a tendency, to the extent there was a big gap one way or the other, they tend to close up as you get closer to the election. And I think the two biggest variables for the presidential election, which we really won't know until actually election day, is number one, what's happening with the U.S. economy. Is it recovering, and how do people feel about the economy and going forward? And the second is the turnout, and that's something that polls can't really measure. It's really, you know, how many people come out, who's more enthusiastic, and so forth. So I would agree that it's a little bit too early yet.
Well, there are certainly multiple challenges this time facing the Trump campaign. For instance, you have the pandemic, which is still rampant, and then you have the racial tension that has been raging across the country, and then you have the unemployment number, which looks very bad. So at least in one of the two variables you were mentioning, you know, the economic side, it doesn't look very good. So what impact do you think the current challenges in the United States, such as the ones that I mentioned, will have on Trump's re-election bid? And how different do you think the socioeconomic background now is from that in 2014? Jack?
Well, a couple points. One is that it is very different from 2016. In 2016, you know, we had kind of a sluggish economy, not a bad economy, but it wasn't really a roaring economy. You know, this time around, we had a very good economy going into February, where unemployment rates were the lowest they've ever been for all categories of workers. And of course, the shutdown and the pandemic has really hurt the economy, and unemployment is at an all-time high. However, it kind of depends on how, you know, what happens, you know, once America gets back to work fully. In most states now, I'm in New Jersey. You know, New Jersey is step by step getting back to, you know, to work. It kind of depends on what happens as the entire country goes back to work. Now, there are some very promising signs. You know, there was a good jobs number in, you know, in April, without even the full effect of the U.S. opening up. Retail sales in May were up much stronger than people thought. So clearly the economy is going to be the big trigger, because that's what people feel in their pocketbook.
Yeah.
The racial tensions, I think, you know, on the one hand could hurt, but they could also help.
Well, let me go to Zhao Hai and find out his take on the situation. At least we can compare what it was like 4 months ahead of the 2016 elections to this time around. Zhao Hai, what is the biggest difference that stands out to you?
Well, I really don't think that the U.S. economy is that strong in 2019, because even though the unemployment number was really quite low, however, the reality is there are a lot of people doing 2 or 3 jobs and those jobs created during the Trump years are low-paying jobs in services. So I really think that there's already a problem accumulating in 2019 through 2018, 2019. So by 2020, when the pandemic hit and those people lost their jobs, and most of those people have no savings to sustain them through even 2 or 3 months. At this point, they have to depend on the government subsidy and 1, 2, and even 3 times of congressional legislation to sustain this time. So I think that's why Trump is eager to reopen the economy, because he realized that this economy is not resilient enough to go through this impact. And we have seen, even though there's rebound numbers, however, I don't think this number is going to continue for the next 2 or 3 months. Another high wave is coming, probably the continuing of the first wave or the second wave. No matter what, this pandemic is not over, and the economy is not going to be strong as President Trump would like it to be.
Okay, let me move on to the policy on China, because we're trying to find out what China can expect, in 4 months' time. In terms of blaming China, President Trump is probably champion in the world. I mean, his administration. All kinds of things have been said. For instance, COVID-19 being the China virus or Wuhan virus, or that the virus was created or manufactured in the lab in Wuhan, or that he ordered Maine federal government pension fund not to invest in Chinese companies, citing risk of future sanctions over Beijing's handling of COVID-19. He signed into law Act on Hong Kong, or Act on Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and now he's calling the COVID-19 the Kung Fu flu. So some people are saying Trump's attack on China could ruin his re-election bid. Of course, there are people who think the opposite. Jack, what's your take?
I don't really think that that his attacks on China, really will ruin his chances. In all the presidential elections going back to to the early '90s, every presidential candidate, in one way or another, has taken issue with China. It's a very easy target because of the fact that it's far away. Most people don't understand very much about China, and most people don't have any kind of dealings on a day-to-day basis with China. So it's an easy target, and I think that all presidential candidates have one way or another done that. So I don't think, as far as affecting the election, I don't think it's going to have a big impact. Again, I think the bigger impact is going to be, what does the economy look like? How do people feel in their pocketbook?
Yeah, well, Biden is also seems be playing the China card. In the released digital ad, he ripped Trump as too willing to accept Chinese government explanations in the early days of the pandemic, calling Trump being rolled over for the Chinese and that he would go tougher on China. So, Jack, what could we expect? What could China expect in terms of toughness if Joe Biden wins?
I don't think there's any question that that certainly the relationship will be a lot less confrontational with Joe Biden as president. I expect President Trump, should he be re-elected, will continue to be tough on China in terms of trade and so forth. Biden looked back at the Obama administration, where Biden was the vice president. It was kind of a very cozy relationship between China and the United States. You didn't really have a lot of confrontation. So, I think he has to be, play the China card, if you will, because, Trump is telling people that he would be weak on China. But I think in reality, when push comes to shove, a Biden presidency would have a much more harmonious relationship with China.
Let me try to get Zhao Hai's opinion on this. Zhao Hai, for yourself and also for other Chinese commentators or observers who are analyzing the situation, what is their gauge on the toughness or softness of his China policy if Joe Biden wins the election?
We really don't think that there's going to be much difference other than personality, other than minor issues, the minor differences between the Biden and Trump administration. because at this point, I think the long-term strategic competition is already a bi-party consensus on China. So overall, the Chinese policy making in the United States has quite a consolidated Washington elite base. So fundamentally, I think in many areas, the U.S. has its position and China has its own position. It's very hard to reconciliate. And because of this overall trend or strategic setting that's happening in Washington, D.C. However, I want to come back to one of the things we've talked about just now, which is the pandemic and China policy. I think looking back, someday the U.S. will realize that the failure of cooperation between U.S. and China is one of the major issues or major causes for U.S. death and continuing deterioration of the pandemic situation in the United States. And that's an opportunity lost. And if in the future days of, for example, Biden administration, they will definitely looking back and see this as an area for cooperation, and they should realize that without U.S.-China cooperation in many areas on global challenges, it's impossible to handle dealing with this kind of challenges. And hopefully, no matter which administration would be in the coming year, they would realize this and find a common ground, at least on some global governance issues.
But very briefly, Zhao Hai, what is China preparing for at this moment? Because there are people who are saying probably a lot of Chinese would prefer Joe Biden to be elected, so that because he's going to be maybe a little bit softer or at least a little bit more rational. So what are the Chinese government, to your understanding, preparing? How are they preparing for the two possible scenarios?
No, that's only my personal view, not representing the Chinese government. I think no, it doesn't matter which person is in the White House. What matters most is what kind of strategy, what kind of policy that they will make concerning China. So at this point, we are preparing for both the continuation of the current Trump policy and also a potential possible Biden administration change in terms of policy towards China. However, on many issues, China will insist on its core interest and will not relent or shaking in terms of its own ground and its own national interest.
Of course. All right. Many thanks to Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Jack Perkowski, Founder and Managing Partner of JFP Holdings.